Because your basic education is in history, as far as I understand.
Yes.
Тогда я позволю себе
So if you don't mind, I will take only 30 seconds or 1 minute to give you a short reference to history for giving you a little historical background.
Please.
Вот смотрите, с чего
Let's
начались
look
наши
where our
отношения?
relationship with Ukraine started from.
Откуда она взялась?
Where did Ukraine come from?
Российское государство стало
The
собираться
Russian state started gathering itself as a centralized statehood,
годом создания российского государства,
and it is considered to be the year of the establishment of the Russian state in 862,
Новгород на северо-западе страны
when the townspeople of Novgorod invited a Varangian prince, Rurik, from Scandinavia to reign.
варягов. 862 год. В 1800
In 1862, Russia celebrated the 1000th anniversary of its statehood.
своей государственности и в Новгороде.
And in Novgorod, there is a memorial dedicated to the 1000th anniversary of the
В
country.
882 году
In 882, Rurik's successor, Prince Oleg, who was actually playing the role of regent at Rurik's younger son,
по сути функция регента
because Rurik had died by that time, came to Kiev.
к этому времени пришел в Киев, отстранил от власти двух братьев,
He ousted two brothers who apparently had
членами дружины Рюрика,
once been members of Rurik's squad.
имея два центра в Киеве и в Новгороде.
So Russia began to develop with two centers of power, Kiev and Novgorod.
Следующая очень значимая дата в истории
The
России
next very significant date in the history of Russia was 988.
Владимир
This was the baptism of Russia, when Prince Vladimir, the great-grandson of Rurik, baptized Russia and adopted Orthodoxy, or Eastern Christianity.
централизованное российское государство.
From this time, the centralized Russian state began to strengthen.
Единая территория,
Why?
единое
Because of the single territory, integrated economic ties,
один язык,
one and the same language, and, after the baptism of Russia, the same faith and rule of the prince. The centralized Russian state began to take shape.
российское государство.
Back in the Middle Ages, Prince Yaroslav the Wise introduced the order of succession to a throne.
Введение престола наследия.
But after he passed away, it became complicated for various reasons.
Чуть-чуть попозже, после того, как он ушел из жизни.
The throne was passed not directly from father to eldest son, but from the prince who had passed away to his brother, then to his sons in different lines.
Потом сыновьям по разным линиям. Все это привело к
All this led to the fragmentation and the end of Rus as a single state.
раздробленности.
There was nothing special about it. The same was happening then in Europe.
Но раздробленное русское государство стало легкой добычей.
But the fragmented Russian state became an easy prey to the empire created earlier by Genghis Khan.
Хан Батый пришли на Русь,
His successors, namely Batu Khan, came to Rus, plundered and ruined nearly all the cities. The southern part, including Kiev, by the way, and some other cities, simply lost independence, while northern cities preserved some of their sovereignty.
в Орду. Но часть суверенитета сохранили.
They had to pay tribute to the horde, but they managed to preserve some part of their sovereignty.
Начало складываться единое российское государство.
And then a unified Russian state began to take shape with its center in Moscow.
Оно начало
The southern part of Russian lands, including Kiev,
к тому центру, который складывался.
began to gradually gravitate towards another magnet, the center that was emerging in Europe.
Его даже называли литовско-русским.
This was the Grand Duchy of Lithuania.
Составляли значительную
It was even called the Lithuanian-Russian Duchy, because Russians were a significant part of this population.
славными.
They spoke the old Russian language and
Затем
were
произошло
Orthodox.
объединение, уния Великое княжество Литовское.
But then there was a unification, the union of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Kingdom of Poland.
Написано. Уже в духовной сфере.
A few years later, another union was signed,
Священников подчинилось власти.
but this time already in the religious sphere.
И таким образом вот эти земли
Some of the
оказались в
Orthodox
составе
priests became
польско-литовского
subordinate to the Pope. Thus, these lands became part of the Polish-Lithuanian state.
ополячиванием этой части населения. язык внедряли туда свой.
During decades, the Poles were engaged in Polonization of this part of the population.
Они живут в Украине.
They introduced their language there, tried to entrench the idea that this population was not exactly Russians, that because they lived on the fringe, they were Ukrainians.
Занимается
Originally, the word Ukrainian meant that a person was living on the outskirts of the state, along the fringes, or was engaged in a border patrol service. It didn't mean any particular ethnic group.
поляки всячески
So the Poles were trying to,
относились
in every possible way, to colonize this part of the Russian lands, and actually treated it rather harshly, not to say cruelly. All that led to the fact that this part of the Russian lands began to struggle for their rights.
писали письма. в
They
Варшаву.
wrote letters to Warsaw demanding that their rights be observed and people be commissioned here, including to Kiev.
I beg your pardon, can you tell us what period, I'm losing track of where in history we are,
Это было
the Polish
это
oppression
было
of
в 13
Ukraine?
веке. Это было
It was in the
было в
13th century.
14 веке. Ну вот, в 13 веке. Это было в 13 веке. Значит, и
Now I will tell you what happened later
дальше и назову даты, чтобы не было путаницы.
and give the dates so that there is no confusion.
В 1600,
And in 1654, even a bit earlier,
чуть раньше даже, люди, которые контролировали
the
власть,
people who were in control of the authority over that part of the Russian lands
чтобы присылали к ним
addressed Warsaw, I repeat, demanding that they send them to rulers of Russian origin and Orthodox faith. When Warsaw did not answer them, and in fact rejected their demands, they turned to Moscow, so that Moscow took them away.
чтобы вы не думали, что я что-то придумал, Дима.
So that you don't think that I'm inventing things, I'll give you these
Я вам
documents.
отдам вот эти документы.
Well, it doesn't sound like you're inventing it. I'm not sure why it's relevant to what happened 2 years ago.
Но все-таки
But still,
документы из архива.
these are documents from the archives, copies.
Здесь письма Богдана
Here are the letters from Bogdan Khmelnytsky,
контролировал власть в этой
the man who then controlled the power in this part of the Russian lands
в Варшаву.
that is now called Ukraine.
А после того, как
He wrote to Warsaw demanding that their rights be upheld,
с просьбой взять их,
and after being refused, he began to write letters to Moscow, asking to take them under the strong hand of the Moscow Tsar. There are copies of these documents. I will leave them for your good memory. There is a translation into Russian. You can translate it into English later.
потому что
Russia would not agree to admit them straight away, assuming that the war with Poland would start. Nevertheless, in 1654, the Pan-Russian Assembly of top clergy and landowners, headed by the Tsar,
часть древнерусских земель вошла
which was the representative body of the power of the old Russian state, decided to include a part of the old Russian lands into Moscow Kingdom.
перемирие было заключено.
As expected, the war with Poland began. It lasted 13 years, and then in 1654,
По-моему, 2
a
года
truce was concluded.
мир с Польшей. Вечный мир, как это было.
And 32 years later, I think, a peace treaty with Poland, which they called Eternal Peace, was signed.
Отошла к России.
And these lands, the whole left bank of Dnieper, including Kiev, went to Russia.
Затем, во времена
And the whole right bank of Dnieper remained in
Россия
Poland.
вернула все исторические земли.
Under the rule of Catherine the Great, Russia reclaimed all of its historical lands, including in the south and west.
Да, а вот
This all lasted until the revolution.
воспользовавшись
Before World War I,
украинизацией,
Austrian General Staff relied on the ideas of Ukrainianization and started actively promoting the ideas of Ukraine and the Ukrainianization.
в преддверии мировой войны, конечно, было стремление ослабить потенциал.
Their motive was obvious.
Было стремление
Just before World War I, they wanted to weaken the potential enemy and secure themselves favorable conditions in the border area. So the idea which had emerged in Poland that people residing in that territory were allegedly not really Russians, but rather belonged to a special ethnic group, Ukrainians, started being propagated by the Austrian General Staff. As far back as the 19th century, theorists calling for Ukrainian independence appeared. All those, however, claimed that Ukraine should have a very good relationship with Russia. They insisted on that. After the 1917 revolution, the Bolsheviks sought to restore the statehood, and the civil war began, including the hostilities with Poland. In 1921, peace with Poland was proclaimed, and under that treaty, the right bank of Dnieper River once again was given back to Poland. In 1939, after Poland cooperated with Hitler, it did collaborate with Hitler, you know? Hitler offered Poland peace and a treaty of friendship. An alliance demanding in return that Poland give back to Germany the so-called Danzig corridor, which connected the bulk of Germany with East Prussia and Königsberg. After World War I, this territory was transferred to Poland, and instead of Danzig, a city of Gdansk emerged. Hitler asked them to give it amicably, but they refused.
Of course.
Still, they collaborated with Hitler and engaged together in the partitioning of Czechoslovakia.
But may I ask you, you're making the case that Ukraine, certainly parts of Ukraine, Eastern Ukraine, is in effect Russia, has been for hundreds of years. Why wouldn't you just take it when you became president 24 years ago? You have nuclear weapons, they don't. If it's actually your land, why did you wait so long?
I'll tell you. I'm coming to that. This briefing is coming to an end. It might be boring, but it explains many things.
I just don't know how it's relevant.
Good. Good. I'm so gratified that you appreciate that. Thank you. So, before World War II, Poland collaborated with Hitler, and although it did not yield to Hitler's demands, it still participated in the partitioning of Czechoslovakia together with Hitler, as the Poles had not given the Danzig corridor to Germany and went too far, pushing Hitler to start World War II by attacking them. Why was it Poland against whom the war started on 1st September 1939? Poland turned out to be uncompromising, and Hitler had nothing to do but start implementing his plans with Poland. By the way, the USSR, I have read some archive documents, behaved very honestly. It asked Poland's permission to transit its troops through the Polish territory to help Czechoslovakia. But the then Polish foreign minister said that if the Soviet planes flew over Poland, they would be downed over the territory of Poland. But that doesn't matter. What matters is that the war began, and Poland fell prey to the policies it had pursued against Czechoslovakia, as under the well-known Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Part of the territory, including western Ukraine, was to be given to Russia. Thus, Russia, which was then named the USSR, regained its historical lands. After the victory in the Great Patriotic War, as we call World War II, all those territories were ultimately enshrined as belonging to Russia, to the USSR. As for Poland, it received, apparently in compensation, the lands which had originally been German. The eastern parts of Germany, these are now western lands of Poland. Of course, Poland regained access to the Baltic Sea and Danzig, which was once again given its Polish name.
Вот таким образом сложилось.
So this was how this situation
При
developed.
формировании Советского Союза, это уже в 1900
In 1922, when the USSR was being established,
большевики начали формировать
the
СССР.
Bolsheviks started building the USSR and established the Soviet Ukraine, which had never existed before.
Right.
Который до сих пор вообще не существовало. При этом Сталин настаивал,
Stalin insisted that those republics be included in the USSR as
входили в качестве автономных образований.
autonomous entities.
Основатель советского государства Ленин настоял.
For some inexplicable reason, Lenin, the founder of the Soviet state, insisted that they be entitled to withdraw from the USSR.
Наделил
And
образующуюся
again, for some unknown reasons, he transferred to that newly established Soviet Republic of Ukraine some of the lands together with people living there, even though those lands had never been called Ukraine, and yet they were made part of that Soviet Republic of Ukraine. Those lands included the Black Sea region, which was received under Catherine the Great, and which had no historical connection with Ukraine whatsoever. Even if we go as far back as 1654, when these lands returned to Russian Empire, that territory was the size of 3 to 4 regions of modern Ukraine, with no Black Sea region. That was completely out of the question.
In 1654.
Exactly.
You obviously have encyclopedic knowledge of this region, but why didn't you make this case for the first 22 years as president that Ukraine wasn't a real country?
Да. Итак, значит, советская Украина получила
The Soviet Union was given a great deal of territory that had never belonged to it, including the Black Sea region.
когда Россия их получила в результате
At some point, when Russia received them as an outcome of the Russo-Turkish Wars,
России.
they were called New Russia or Novorossiya.
Ленин основатель
But that does not matter. What matters is that Lenin, the founder of the Soviet state,
И вот это все
established Ukraine that way.
в составе СССР
For decades, the Ukrainian Soviet Republic developed as part of the USSR,
по непонятным